Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, GoMRI Synthesis and Legacy Efforts. This session has two moderators. They include myself, Helena Solo Gabriel, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Miami, and Cam Ainsworth, Associate Professor of Biology at the University of South Florida. I will be moderating the introduction, and Cam will be moderating the questions. Questions can be entered anytime during the webinar in the chat box located to the bottom or right of your screen. Cam will consolidate a subset of the questions for speakers to answer at the end of the three presentations. As part of Core 7B synthesis efforts, we seek to develop a conceptual modeling framework that will align new knowledge gained since the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This framework would set the foundation for a quantitative model that can be used to address broad questions posed by stakeholders in the event of a future oil spill. An example of these broad questions is shown in the following slide. Oops. Monica Wilson of Sea Grant will briefly explain the origin of these questions.
Hello, thank you, Elena. So, as Helena said, my name is Monica Wilson. I'm the representative of the Sea Grant Oil Spill Science Outreach Team. The team aims to increase the use of oil spill science by people whose livelihoods depend on a healthy Gulf of Mexico. Our team continuously engages with people in small and large group settings to learn about their oil spill science related questions and concerns. The questions shared here represent our target audience input between 2014 and 2018. Our team solicits input multiple ways: by one-on-one or small group meetings with target audience members, input sessions with large groups of target audience members, and through evaluations completed before and after oil spill seminars and workshops. These questions were pulled specifically for this core area synthesis, and they do not represent the entirety of the data Sea Grant has collected from the program.
Thank you, Monica. Our initial starting point for developing an integrated and linked model is given in the following four-box figure, where we have identified the four domains of knowledge: physics, ecosystems, socio-economics, and human health. Answering the broad questions posed by stakeholders in future spills requires that we address the details of the linkages between each of these domains. The purpose of the Human Health webinar series, specifically, is to discuss the factors needed to simulate both physical and psychological health in response to oil spills. Modeling of physical health will be presented by Dr. Alesia Ferguson of North Carolina A&T. The modeling of psychological health impacts will be presented by Dr. David Abramson of New York University. Dr. Claire Paris of the University of Miami will present models of physics, ecosystems, and social economics, which can serve as a basis for establishing linkages with human health. Following this webinar, there will be a virtual working session scheduled for Thursday, May 9th from 10 a.m. to 12 noon Eastern Time. During this virtual working session, we have invited guests that will be discussing the beginnings of a conceptual model framework. If you're interested in listening in this virtual session, please type your email address into the written chat box located on the bottom right hand of your screen. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to our speakers and invite Dr. Alesia Ferguson to introduce herself and describe her vision on how to simulate physical human health impacts in response to oil spills.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me and can everyone see my screen?
I can.
Okay.
Yep, looks good.
I'm Alesia Ferguson. I'm an associate professor and interim chair at North Carolina A&T in the Built Environment Department. I've been invited to speak on modeling human physical health risk, primarily due to exposures to oil spill chemicals. I am part of a study funded through GoMRI to look at the health risks to children following oil spills. The project is called Beaches, Beach Exposure and Child Health Study. The PI is Dr. Helena Sola Gabriello from University of Miami, Dr. Meno from University of Texas, and myself are co-PIs on the project. We have or have had a number of other researchers and students involved in this project. Some of the ideas and approaches that I will share with you today on modeling human health risk are in the context of some of the work we are doing on beaches. The US population in coastal counties or areas is already dense and is expected to continue to grow from 123 million to 134 million by 2020. Oil spills and coastal storms threaten human health and well-being, coastal economies, and the ecology of the area. Oil spills are not uncommon in coastal areas or even inland. In 2017 alone, there were over 147 incidents recorded by NOAA. We are also well aware of the devastating number of strong hurricanes just over the last few years. The impacts of both vary, where there can be an overlap in the environmental impacts. Hurricanes can, for example, lead to the release of oil by damaging a rig or a pipeline. It can also result in the dispersal of oil and even the churning of embedded oil from previous events. Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010 was the largest US spill of 206 million gallons, where every oil recovery and dispersal method was applied. Impacts were felt across 5 states. There is a great need to understand the complexity of health impacts caused by hurricanes and oil spills for humans, and even the differences between the two. When both are happening at the same time, the complexity increases. The physical and mental impacts of both hurricanes and oil spills are challenging to decipher. For oil spills, it is particularly hard to get a hand on the physical health outcomes, such as respiratory effects or cancer outcomes caused by exposure to oil, when mental outcomes caused by oil spills can in turn lead to physical outcomes. Specifically, mental outcomes caused by stress due to the loss of livelihood, displacement, family disruptions, and loss of property can lead to stress, loss of healthcare access, and in turn mental and physical diseases. So we will focus here on the physical outcomes to oil spill chemicals, with the recognition that there are timelines in which both are occurring or in close proximity, making it difficult to separate these health impacts. Risk is defined as the probability of an adverse outcome. Generally, there are 2 ways to look at risk: an indirect approach and a direct approach. Direct can, for example, mean fitting a subject with a personal sampler and using the mass collected on the sampler to estimate inhalation exposure. We can also use biological monitoring to look at aggregate exposure via all routes. This was done for some cleanup workers during the oil spill. We can be limited under certain circumstances to use the direct approach. Not all populations can be sampled, and timing does not allow, and it's costly. Indirect approach is the modeling approach to combine data for use in algorithms to make estimates of exposure and/or dose. We are going to use or focus today on the indirect approach to look at physical health risks. Benefits of a risk assessment, especially the indirect approach, are many. It helps us to identify the source of exposure, identify those prevalent risks, and we can perform these estimates over various scenarios or populations. This is the general human health risk model that can be applied to any population or exposure scenario for the indirect approach. The Beaches project, the project that we're working on, will estimate children's exposure to oil spill contaminants by creating a modeling platform based on children's actual visits and play activities on the beach. The health risk model first starts with a focus on the source of exposure and ends with the health risk. Applying that model to this exposure scenario says that we need to know the concentrations of the oil spills in the environment and how a population comes into contact with that contaminant concentration. Understanding the uptake dynamics and the toxicity of the compound, how it distributes, how it metabolizes in the body, allows us to determine health risk, chance of an adverse health outcome. There are lots of chemicals involved in a chemical spill. Crude oil is comprised of hydrocarbons, organic compounds, and small amounts of metals. Hydrocarbons are the main component. Every oil has its signature. This is in fact how we sometimes identify the responsible party. The aromatic hydrocarbons are typically more toxic, and some are persistent in the environment. Others might be focused on dispersants used to manage a spill by allowing the oil to break down. These are mixtures of emulsifiers, solvents, surfactants. What is challenging is to understand exposure to chemical mixtures, more than one chemical, and a host of byproducts that may form in the environment following an oil spill. Tracking an oil spill in the larger environment means we need to understand the chemical constituents of the oil and the location and timing of the event. We must also understand the environment and ocean condition as the oil mass shores. Furthermore, looking at health risks requires determining chemical concentrations for targeted OSCs in various nearshore media, such as floating water, beach sand, dissolved shellfish, and in air for compounds that are volatile or that may resuspend. These are the media that humans contact. We have some idea in our project for how we want to determine these nearshore concentrations from larger fate and transport models, such as Noah's genome model. In the end, various fate and transport models would need to merge in some seamless fashion so we can determine where one ends and one starts and address the uncertainties and variabilities surrounding these concentration estimates. The next step in the human risk assessment process is determining human activities for any exposure scenario. Contact can occur through the dermal inhalation and/or ingestion route, depending on the properties of the chemical or where we spend time. If we consider potentially 3 populations, we might want to know how and to what extent children, first responders, and fish consumers are exposed, where one route may be more important than the other for that population. The types of activity patterns needed include, but are not limited to, contact duration and frequency with sand and beach water, visits to the beach, consumption patterns, and hygiene activities, and even work schedules. We can obtain some of this information from existing databases, but other types of information, such as children's dermal contact with sand and number of visits to the beach during winter or summer months, may not exist. This then means we have to collect this information through surveys, recall diaries, or even through innovative techniques, such as videotaping and video translation. We can also use the literature for existing and relevant data. In any risk assessment, there are other considerations, such as the time frame for risk assessment or the time frame for exposure, and that may depend on the toxic effect of the chemical and the persistency of the chemical in the environment. Determining toxicity of any compound requires understanding the pharmacokinetic process in the body: uptake, distribution, metabolism, activity, organ and cell interaction. We can study this in numerous ways, mainly animal and human studies in vivo or in vitro. In the end, what we need are slope values for cancer outcomes and maximum reference doses for non-cancer outcomes to apply to any exposure and dose estimate. Databases exist for some of these compounds, but not many are well studied. Sometimes we have to relate the toxicity of one compound to the other based on the structure class differences. We have to give some consideration as to whether these toxicity endpoints represent our population or a population whose health is already compromised, say from environmental stress that has compromised the immune system or the repair functions in the body. Okay, let's illustrate what a risk calculation might look like for one compound, meaning how we put all this information together. These are simplistic algorithms, a snapshot, deterministic equation that use point values for estimating cancer outcomes for 3 routes of exposure: oral, dermal, and inhalation. This is one point in time. Looking at just the dermal equation, center at the bottom of your screen, here we see that to determine dose through the dermal route for a child requires knowing the concentration of the chemical in the sand, the adherence of that sand to the skin, exposure frequency and duration, and that absorption rate through the skin. Various averaging times are used based on the health risk endpoint. Here, lifetime averaging times are used and combined with the slope factor for a cancer outcome, slope factor being the FF in your equation. We can then aggregate across all routes of exposure to get total exposure. The table also shows that we will be doing this for daily doses and risk levels for non-cancer outcomes. If we have good data sets, meaning a rich data set, we can create probability distributions and sample from those for distribution, exposure, and health outcomes for a population. Next on your screen, in the end, what we would like is to have various models and data sets blending together, so fate and transport and activity models being used to get exposure in these dose estimates. Our toxicity values would then help us to estimate health risk. We can map these risk estimates spatially over time to look at high-risk areas for populations. What do we do when we have these health risk estimates? Well, there are challenges of communicating risk to especially the community. And in fact, variable and multiple communication methods and strategies are needed. Messages should be simple, they should be clear, we should have a distinct language on what is known and what is not known. and based on the best that we can do with these real-time risk estimates. In the end, it would be nice that when we have an oil spill, there's a dynamic model that predicts the shoring and distribution of contaminants, and based on how the beach is typically used, to be able to show red zones, high-risk areas for different exposure populations. Naturally, you close beaches or you halt seafood consumption to protect the most vulnerable, but it is also unnecessary to do any of these activities if there is no real risk. In fact, greater damage can be done to a community by closing the beach or halting seafood consumption. Lastly, I want to give you a general idea of what we're going to be doing on the Beaches project to get at this endpoint of being able to estimate health risks for children under 6 playing on beaches. We have used videotaping and video translation to collect micro and meso activity patterns for 120 children. You know, for example, where on the beach they spend time, what is their hand-to-mouth activity for ingestion exposure. We have used macro surveys to look at family and child behaviors on the beaches, such as hygiene practices, number of visits to the beach. We have also collected sand and body adherence data. Right now, we're processing all that activity data. We're modeling nearshore OS concentrations. We've published, we've submitted a few papers. We're working on a bunch of papers. We're collecting toxicity values for compounds of interest, and we're building this risk platform. In the end, we want to ask questions and answer questions such as, what are our high-risk beaches? What do the activity patterns look like? Are beach closures for a certain time following an oil event enough? Thank you. I hope you see some value in this approach for risk assessment.
Alesia, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. Greatly appreciated. At this point, I'd like to move to the second presentation. I'd like to ask Dr. David Abramson to introduce himself and describe his vision for simulating psychological human health impacts in response to oil spills.
Great, thank you very much, Helena, and good morning, everybody. My name is David Abramson. I'm an associate professor of social and behavioral sciences at NYU's College of Global Public Health. And this slide shows some of the primary data projects that my group works on and that I'm going to be referencing today. In particular, I'll be talking about a few of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill survey projects, the Women and Their Children's Health Study, the WATCH study that we did in collaboration with Louisiana State University, as well as the Gulf Coast Population Impact Project, and a Katrina and a Sandy project as well. So when we think about a socio-ecological framework for recovery, we use a basic dose response framing with which we build everything around it. And in many ways, this is a direct continuation of what you just heard from Alesia. So what you're looking at here is this, this notion that as exposure increases, whatever the direct and secondary effects might be, that's going to have an effect on long-term recovery. You could substitute any of those component pieces. I mean, for the moment, you're looking at the recovery as a multi-dimensional model with 5 dimensions to it: economic and housing stability, physical and mental well-being, and social role adaptation. But it would be equally true that there's going to be a relationship hypothesized between the dose and any of those aspects of recovery. And by the way, when we talk about social role adaptation, we're thinking about how people's identity shifts after an event, as they become survivors, victims, however they sort of constitute their identity. In terms of some of the mediators and moderators that are going to influence this path between the dose and the response, there's obviously the formal help system. There are a number of post-event moderators that occur after the event has taken place, and they can happen at multiple levels, at community, household, or individual levels. At a community level, we often think about, and we model and test things such as the institutions that emerge or that existed in the communities that these survivors live in. At a household level, we may be thinking about how people perceive the community around them, how well functioning the family is, the strength of their social support. At an individual level, we're thinking about a lot of these psychological characteristics such as self-efficacy, locus of control, and even religiosity. But of course, before the event occurred, there are a number of stressors which are going to have an impact both on the exposure and on the outcome. And similar to the post-event moderators, these pre-event effects, these stressors can happen at multiple levels. You can imagine community level stressors such as social vulnerability and disparities, or even exposure to multiple disasters. At household levels, you've got poverty, single-parent households, and income and housing instability. And individual level stressors include comorbidities such as poor mental or poor physical health. There are also buffers or capitals, whether they are social or economic or human capitals, that exist prior to the event, things that are both at the individual and at the household level. And then time makes a difference. So when you're looking at something like recovery or you're looking at mental health, it's obvious that it's going to be a function of when you're looking at it and how much time has elapsed. So most immediately, I'm going to talk about first a study that we did in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the Gulf Coast Population Impact Project, in which our goal was to obtain a representative sample of households with kids across a 4-state region from Florida to Louisiana. We were operationalizing community as a zip code. We used a multi-stage sampling design. One thing that we did in order to determine where the footprint of greatest impact was is we created a Z-score, a standardized score that was built on several publicly available data points on the aggregate number of BP claims by individuals, BP business claims, as well as some of the NOAA oil assessment exposure scores. And we used that to fundamentally create a map, a heat map. This is just showing the individual claims, one of the 3 data points, but we were creating a heat map to then guide our survey work. And so when you look at the top box here, what you see is the heat map with all 3 elements in it. And then the middle box with the blue shows you the 15 highly impacted communities that we elected to focus on for the survey work between Florida and Louisiana. And then for a later project, we ended up doing qualitative work in a selected number of communities that were the highest of the high that we identified. And you could see that in the bottom purple. And so when we looked at exposure by children across these 4 states, we had 1,437 households that we visited and did household surveys with those households. You could see that there's, first of all, a fair extent of exposure here, and we distinguish between physical, environmental, and economic exposure. So the physical exposure was a parent saying that the child participated in oil cleanup activities or had direct contact with oil, dispersants, tar balls, etc., or with even when playing on the beach. Environmental was the parent saying that the smell of oil was moderately to extremely strong. And economic was based on the parent reporting that the household lost income. And you could see that these are all fairly high and also vary across the states. When we took these questions of exposure and looked at what was their relationship to physical health in the child or mental health in the child, and these are all statistically significant odds ratios, we found that, for example, looking at the adjusted direct physical exposure, children whose parents said they had direct physical exposure were 3 times as likely to have physical health effects and 3.7 times as likely to have mental health effects. The direct physical exposure does appear to be the one with the greatest impact, but all of them are obviously influential in this score, and you could see that we've controlled for things that would otherwise explain some of the differences, health insurance, BP compensation, poverty, etc. Some of our colleagues at Louisiana State University, also on the WATCH study, the Women and Their Children's Health study, in which we split the tasks. They did studies of the women while we did studies of the kids. And this is one of the graphics from work that they did on the women. And I think it's particularly useful because what it shows, it's a structural equation model. is that there's a relationship, certainly between physical exposure to the oil spill and depression, not a direct effect from economic, but that there's a considerable exposure through these social aspects of structural social capital, meaning do people participate in local social institutions? Cognitive social capital, do they have a good sense of community? Social support, do they have established reciprocal relationships with people for exchanging help? All of which actually have a great effect on depression. When we talked to the kids, we have both, for the WATCH study, we have interviews with the kids, interviews with the mothers. And what you could see here, that when we ask, what are the factors that influence the kids' mental health or stress, there's a difference by whether you're speaking with the mother or the child. One of the greatest factors influencing the child's mental health from when you look at the mother's side is actually the mother's mental health. When you ask it from the kid's side about high perceived stress, it's the physical exposure. We've taken this and we've built some nested models of looking at child mental health where we're looking at multiple levels of influence. In this study, which we're working on right now, we're actually focusing on the community level and the social institutions. And our question is, do kids who live in areas which have a density of these pro-social institutions do better than kids who don't? Although I don't have the final data to show you here, I can tell you even preliminarily the answer is yes, they do. Very briefly, I'm going to also show you how we've looked across multiple disasters to sort of ask the question, is there a generalizable effect? And essentially asking the question, are the disaster effects unique to the disaster or are they generalizable? So we look across Katrina, the oil spill, and Sandy. We have 4 different cohort studies that we used for this purpose. I'm not going to go into details now. I will leave the slides for you to look at. We categorized exposure. It's not the same exposure variable in each study, so we came up with a categorical measure of major, moderate, and little or no exposure in which to distinguish exposure levels in each one of these studies. They are very different cohorts. The Katrina study is more impoverished. The Sandy study is the least impoverished of them. And then we did essentially a multivariable regression analysis. This is an odds ratio, and what you're seeing is the likelihood that a parent reports poor overall health for the child. And here you're seeing the 2 major effects are poverty, pre-existing poverty, and a major exposure, a clear reference to the dose response effect. And none of the specific studies are coming up as a direct effect, which is good. It shows more of a generalizable effect. When we look at mental health, similar, although one of our studies does have an independent effect as well. And so taking this all together, and I'm sorry that I'm collapsing a lot of our studies into this one slide again, but we've tested many different pieces of this and essentially found that direct exposure will lead to those outcomes, but it's often operating with the strength of moderators, such as the household level stressors before the event, which lead to the household stressors after the event, which in turn relate to recovery or health. There are similar effects happening at the individual level. Those individual level moderators beforehand have a great impact on those post-event effects. And then they in turn, of course, influence the health and well-being. And so one thing I'd like to finish with is just a slide that thinks about some of the potential modeling factors for this group to consider. You know, obviously the physical exposure to the agent, whether direct contact and in what way, dermatological, inhaled, ingested, the direct harms of that exposure. Are people ill or injured as a result of them? Are their pets injured? This gets at injury and impact in the house. The second order exposure effects, when we do hurricane studies, we obviously look at housing and displacement. The ecosystem services effects in terms of people's lost access to recreation and occupational services, the economic effects as we've talked about, prior poverty, prior health problems, which could be gained at from secondary data at county and sometimes smaller level, smaller area. And then one of the things that I'd like to suggest to the group is thinking about weakened or disrupted social networks and social support. Particularly in oil spills where you have compensation arenas, it may pay to look at the rates of denied compensation claims as a way of estimating the corrosive effect of an oil spill on social networks. If there are a greater number of denied claims, you could argue that people will feel aggrieved and they'll begin to lose some of their sense of social cohesion. There are clearly potential buffers, some of which I've identified earlier in terms of pro-social and civic institutions. Some of them, the bottom two, would require survey work. It's rare that you're going to find this using secondary available data, psychological resilience or the strong family functioning. So with that, I will turn this back to the moderator, and thank you very much.
David, thank you so much for the excellent presentation. At this point, we'd like to go to our third presentation, where Dr. Claire Paris will be describing her research simulating physics, ecosystems, and socio-economics, which can serve as the basis for linking in human health impacts. Claire?
Hello, hi. Thank you for having me and to speak here about the thinking outside the human health box, possible linkages to oil spill modeling. I am Claire Paris, professor of ocean science at the University of Miami Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. I am a biological oceanographer, and over the years, I have developed and maintained with my wonderful team the open source connectivity modeling system, CMS, which I will be referring to during this presentation. This is a probabilistic Lagrangian modeling platform that is used worldwide by oceanographers and biological oceanographers that is designed to describe dispersion at sea and track the movement of biotic and abiotic plant particles. So initially, the model was developed with an NSF Rapid grant for the oil application in June 2010, just after the Deepwater Horizon spill. And then was funded by the CMH consortium with an interdisciplinary team of collaborator and postdoc. So in this presentation, I will give a brief introduction to the oil spill application of the CMS, which is the objective one. And this work is basically by mostly led by Nathalie Perlin and Anna Vaz through GoMRI CMH. Then I will describe how the oil model input-output is used to link with other models to predict the impact of future oil spill with the example of fishery closures and revenue loss. And this is a work led by our postdoc Igal Berenstein and Sheo Farrell, funded through a National Academy of Science project together with PI Stephen Mursky from USF and co-PI Jim Sancherico, economist from US Davis. So it is definitely an international, interdisciplinary work. So as Dr. Solo Gabriela mentioned, part of the GoMRI Synthesis effort is to develop a conceptual modeling framework that can be used to address broad questions in the event of a future spill. So here we've been thinking along this line and integrating natural and anthropogenic system. So our base biophysical model is the CMS. And the oil application is getting input from the ocean, circulation and atmospheric model from its transport, and from high pressure experiments on live and oil for its initial condition. This is a work by Dr. Michael Schluter and his team, and Dr. Zach Amman as well and his team. So the oil spill model is also modulated by human interventions such as subsea dispersant application. And the CMS is also linked to the Atlantis, an ecosystem model led by Dr. Cameron Ainsworth. For this presentation, I will describe it in more detail, the framework developed to identify the socio-economical impact of oil spill on the fishery community. So first, let's talk about the oil spill modeling framework. So a common approach to oil modeling involves Lagrangian-based methods to advance oil droplets based on environmental conditions, droplet buoyancy, and several individual-based oil fake algorithms. Here we use the application of the CMS, and the model output indicate where the oil and particle advance, but not necessarily the amount of oil that is corresponding to the real case blowout scenario, which is of great concern for the purpose of first response, mitigation effort, and damage assessment of toxicity study. So here the model translates the output of oil droplets, size and density into oil concentration and mass field of the grid. So as a note, I want you to know that the mass is conserved based in the flow rate and the blowout and partition of oil and gas. So this volume and mass field could then be validated and or compare with observation or other models. So why do we do four-dimensional visualization? It's used to investigate dynamically the impact of specific toxicity thresholds on a series of organisms from plankton to whales. For example, here you have different isosurfaces on the 3D plot, and you can pick the threshold you want to see where the oil is going with this concentration. At the same time, we can generate dynamic budget of oil suspended in the water column and its positive and negative anomaly. And I'm describing this because this is exactly what kind of output of the model can be used for linkage with other models. So another thing I want to point out is that you have a lot of uncertainty in the input of the ocean circulation model, just like a forecast for hurricane. We can take two approaches. One is using different climate forcing or different models like GOM, HICOM, ROMS, and so on and so forth. Or we can initialize the model at different times. That is not necessarily the day of the spill, for example here, but use forecast for future days. And this is what we're showing here. We can generate map of probability of oil exceeding a concentration level based on this forecast. So we can do the same to look at probability of exceeding a given value during any day of a forecast period, but also looking at the same way we can compute the probability of beach oil and sedimented oil mass. And I want to point out that there is no intrinsic value of the forecast is used only to make decisions. For example, here you can produce a map of the probability of sedimented oil mass that exceed 1,000 tons along the shore, and the probability of exceeding a given value at the end of a 100-day run. At the same time, you can use this output to look at different scenarios of oil spill. And we can lead to be able to assess spill risk by ranking scenarios from the least to the most impactful for tested variables. So here, for example, the tested variable for different oil spill in different position of the Gulf, East Gulf, West Gulf, or during a Deepwater Horizon that would occur during the fall. You can look at sedimented oil mass on the seafloor, beach oil mass on the coastline, or the length of the oil shoreline. You can look at sea area in kilometer square with total hydrocarbon, petroleum hydrocarbon, or you can select the pH with toxic area that are over a certain threshold, and so on and so forth. So having said that, now we can move to objective 2, which is to quantify oil spill effect on GOM fishery-dependent communities. So here we're focusing on this aspect of linkage between the oil spill model and socio-economical impact models through fishery closure. So a direct impact in the economic loss associated with tourism and seafood industry due to beach closure and fish kill, but another also a very important impact to the economy is the indirect effect mainly through losses in the fishing industry due to fishery closure. So during the Deepwater Horizon spill, about 1/3 of the national exclusive economic zone was closed for fishing. Commercial fishing is a main industry in the Gulf, financially supporting and literally feeding millions of people around the Gulf. So for the fishing industry, thousands of people that lost their job, business and economic loss was estimated to be billions. And 20% of that loss was actually attributed to the fishery closure, in which vast area of the Gulf were closed, like I said before. And this was done to minimize the risk of food contamination and health risk for the fisher. Commercial and recreational fisheries will likely suffer the most losses. However, the effect differed depending on the community vulnerability impact and is dependent of the socio-economical status, like Dr. David Abramson talked about before, by levels of poverty, for example. So in this conceptual model, the risk, which is an objective measure of the likelihood of a hazard event, interacts with mitigation, which is a measure to lessen risk or reduce their impact to produce a hazard potential. This includes socio-economical status like income, political power, prestige, or commercial and industrial development, infrastructure, and lifelines. So an important index is the Social Vulnerability Index, or SOV, that provides a numerical social vulnerability score to each of the US county based on 29 variables derived primarily from the US Census Bureau. So these variables include metrics like wealth, social status, gender, age, ethnicity, and health insurance, among others. So what do we do for the conceptual framework? This is a multi-modal spatially explicit quantitative approach that is composed of the oil transport and fishing vessel movement components, the VMS, or vessel monitoring system, and is used to estimate fishing revenue losses in the aftermath of simulated oil spill and map to the vulnerability of the fishing community. So what we did for the social vulnerability index, we looked at county level socio-economic and demographic data to construct the index for the United States based on 1990 data. So the methodologic chart flow is as follows. We use a fishery potential, positional and behavioral data set, like I said before, the VMS, that is gathered by the onboard fishery observer program, which is recorded on a subset of trips by the GoMRI fish fleet, where independent onboard observer record the time and location when fishing gears are deployed and recovered. Second, we use the VMS system that provides positional information with approximately hour resolution. So the VMS equipment has been mandated on all Gulf of Mexico commercial fishing vessels with a reef fish license since 2006. Finally, the revenue, gear type, and county of landing data were collated for mandatory logbook records. And in the end, what we did, we looked at from simulated oil spill, the closed polygon area on a daily basis. So this is going through these steps. So for this conceptual framework, we use 2 spill scenarios and 2 fisheries. So one simulated oil spill was on the Western Gulf at Keithley Canyon block, and the second in the Eastern GOM at the Elbow block. So we use data from 2 types of fishing methods, longline and bandit reel fishery data sets. This is an example of a video on simulated closure based on toxic oil from the NRDA, the National Resource Damage Assessment 216 values. So these values are in log of oil concentration in ppb, and you can see that you have a change of the closure area on a daily basis. We can do the same for the Eastern GOM. And here you have like a higher value of densities, larger extent of this fish enclosure. And for both fishery, you can look at cumulative closure and fishing activity at the same time. So the dotted line here on the cumulative closure indicates the area of extent of the fishery closure like it was done for the Deepwater Horizon, but here it's based on toxic oil. And for each of the fleet, you have the number of boat trips per county and the number of pings per cell from the VMS data. So that tells us for both fishery that is less activity in the Western Gulf than the Eastern Gulf. So finally, we looked at the fishing revenue versus the social vulnerability index. So here in this figure, you have a fishing revenue loss versus SOV, a score for counties impacted by the two oil spill scenarios. Values are expressed in standard deviation, with 0 representing an average for all fishing counties, impacted or not. The higher SOV score indicates greater social vulnerability to environmental hazard. Marker shapes show gear types like triangle, bottom long line, circle, banded reel, and shading indicates spill scenario. So the white is the Eastern Gulf, and the west is a western. The black is the Western Gulf of Mexico. So the counties falling within the blue, like in the lower left quadrant, are those that suffer relatively little revenue losses and are of low social vulnerability, and therefore may be considered of the lowest concern. Counties in the red, like in the upper right quadrant, are those that suffer relatively high revenue losses and are also of high social vulnerability and are thus of the highest concern. Yellow and magenta quadrant represent high SOV plus low revenue loss and low SOV plus high revenue loss, respectively. So basically, this is a framework that we use to look at the relative impact of giving SOVs for, you can separate it by different long line and for different scenario of oil spill. Different gear, sorry, like the long line and the banded reel. And you see that the gear change a little bit the shape of the fishery closure for this type of gear. And as a result, you have, if you look at where the counties are affected, for example, in the red here, you see a difference in the revenue loss for the different fishing gear, and also obviously for the different location of the oil spill. During the Deepwater Horizon spill, the state most affected by the spill were Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, and least affected were Texas. So having to say that, I'd like to summarize on the framework that we propose for model linkages. We develop and demonstrate an effective probabilistic approach to oil spill. It's supposed to say hindcast, not hindmost, and forecast, meaning looking back and looking forth. We develop a basic quantitative framework for modeling the impact of future oil spill closure on fishery revenues at the county level. So, but what is the importance? Why is it so important? So it doesn't necessarily lie into the actual result that we presented. This one is very limited snapshot, but rather in the fact that we've constructed this framework and it works. So we can perform their own risk assessment, understand how given oil spill might be expressed in the field, and what would be the expected fishery closure to be prepared and to make informed decision and action plans. Future and ongoing work, so it's linkage with Atlantis and the ecosystem modeling, and I'm sure that Cameron Ainsworth will talk about this in the future. We also are planning to work with human health and share the data of the old model for this aspect. And having said that, I'd like to thank Dr. Elena Solo-Gabriela and Dr. Cameron Ainsworth for hosting this. And thank you for listening.
Claire, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I want to take this opportunity now to thank all of our speakers for really informative information as far as coming up with a way to start linking these different topics together. I also like to thank GoMRI and also the organizing committee for 7B for all of the work that went into this. I also like to thank Ocean Leadership for all of the logistics. At this point in time, we have 10 minutes available for questions. There've been a lot of back and forth on the chat box, which is good. Cam, do you want to?
Yes. Well, let me, so there were 3 questions that I think can be handled very quickly, and then there was a more extensive discussion, which I'll summarize very quickly for those who have been listening to the talk rather than reading the chat. John Shepard at University of Southampton asks, why is there a big difference in the treatment between the cancer and non-cancer risks, reference to David's talk. Jeffrey Wycliffe at Tulane, I believe, said in so many words that the units are not the same. And Ashley Ferguson at Texas A&M points out that timescales are not the same. John Shepard points out the value of using common units, and Jerry Wycliffe points out the value of using a probabilistic approach to assess the danger of cancer and non-cancer risks. Ashley Ferguson indicates that this work is already underway. So that's the long conversation. Would anyone like to comment on that?
This is just it's actually Alicia Ferguson.
Oh.
And yeah, you know, doing all these assessments are challenging. To do these probability distributions and risk assessments, you have to have good information. You have to have good data sets. So, and you know, maybe we have it for some parameters and maybe we don't have it for other parameters. So I just wanted to say that all of this is challenging.
This is David Abramson. I'd like to actually comment on the question about timescale, because I think that's a really critical one. In a lot of the work that we do, particularly when we're looking at mental health effects, even more so when we look at long-term recovery, it requires a long timescale. Mental health effects will not necessarily reveal themselves in the short term. We find that there is often a nadir, sort of where it's at its worst at 2 to 3 years after an event, whether the event is a hurricane or an oil spill. Recovery even longer if you want to actually track that in terms of overall community well-being. So I would urge the group to think about time scale, you know, at least at these levels of, 3 to 5 years.
Any other comments regarding that discussion? All right, well, I think we'll probably develop a summary document and we can have that sent around or posted or something. We'll discuss that offline. So there is let me address first a very quick comment that John Shepard made. We need to estimate and include losses due to fish recruitment as well as short-term losses due to closures using Atlantis-type models. So I invite you to join us next week at this time when we discuss the ecosystem modeling. I'll give a very quick introduction to Atlantis, but I'm not one of the speakers, but I think you'll see that we are trying to calculate both short and long-term impacts due to the closures as well as the direct toxicity. Helena asks a question to all speakers. can you comment on what parameters are needed to transfer between the models to answer a question regarding human health impacts of anglers in the area of the spill? Well, why don't we start with the order of the presentations? Alesia, would you like to respond to that?
I'm not sure I'm the best one to answer that question. That's probably best for the third speaker, maybe. I'm going to hand it over.
Claire?
Okay. All right. So I think one of the variables that we calculated in those models is the concentration of oil and the oil mass. So, but it's, when we talk about oil, it's like very general. Those models also provide information of the level of PAH, for example, or any kind of toxic oil. So the output of the model is very flexible in that sense, because the oil droplets are made of pseudo components, and we can track through time the fate of these pseudo component, and we can also track the dissolved components. So basically, the people that are working on these human health models are the ones that should know what they need for those models, but the model itself of oil can produce these values pretty much on demand. So I would think that the concentration and the oil mass are the two most important variable, because with trajectories, for example, you cannot do anything at all. You have to calculate how much. It's not only where it goes, but how much there is.
Cam, it's David Abramson. I wonder if I could just comment briefly.
Please.
It seems to me that the biggest challenge is linking at the exposure level from the ecosystems to the human populations, and that question of what's actual human exposure. I mean, based on the work that we have done, which obviously is focused on human population survey work and qualitative data, we've seen that exposure is highly variable. It's environmentally related, it's economically related, it could be pretty distant to the shore itself. The economic impacts going up through the supply chain, are fairly extensive. So it seems to me that sort of is the key question, and I'm not sure how much it makes sense to, or how it's even feasible, although I heard one of the speakers talk about these modeling efforts to distinguish environmental from economic impacts. One thing that we try to do with our sampling was using the BP oil compensation claims as a data source for economic impact early on. And perhaps that's one way of offering that linkage for the ecosystem to the population.
I think that's a very good point. All right, so the final question is from RT. I don't know who that is. And the question is there space within the dose response modeling framework to include the effects of restoration on human health, and can they be used to inform restoration projects? I think maybe David could answer that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We have not looked at that specific one. We've been looking at long-term recovery post-Katrina after 12 years, so we haven't focused on the long-term recovery post-oil spill. And we've seen the effects of improved environments on the hurricane-affected populations. And I could imagine, I would agree with the speaker, the questioner, that looking at restoration activities should have a very positive effect on human health and well-being. And I think it should definitely be included in a model.
Great. Well, we've covered then all of the discussion in the chat box very briefly. Anyone else have any other comments?
Yes, I have another comment about in case of, especially in the context of photo-enhanced toxicity, when a good safe proxy for human health, the lack of any other information, would be the concentration of half-life for larvae. like the LC50, for example. And this is a good proxy. So there are proxies like this that can be used to evaluate the human health. I think that as we've seen a lot of these papers coming out during the Deepwater Horizon spill, there's been a lot of work looking at the mortality of animals in the ecosystem, whether it's fish larvae in the plankton or in the coastline. And these are the values that we need to use to look at proxy.
Thank you, Claire. Well, that's it for the questions. It's 11 a.m. Helena?
Yes, I just wanted to reiterate again, thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone who's on this video conference webinar. I just wanted to remind, as Cam mentioned earlier, that we have another webinar scheduled 1 week from today, May 13th, same time. And the Zoom link is on the flyer that advertises the webinar series. I also wanted to mention again that we do have that each of these webinars, there is a follow-up virtual working session several days afterwards. If you're interested in learning more about those virtual sessions and listening in, type in your email address into the chat box. But with that, I want to thank everyone for an excellent webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thanks. Thanks very much, Helena. That was really well done and very organized. This is Chuck.
Thank you, Chuck. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.